In December 1987 on a strip Mediterranean coast overcrowded with refugees, a group calling itself the Islamic Resistance Movement was founded. In Arabic its acronym spelled the word meaning Zeal Hamas. Its goal was simple. It wanted to liberate historic Palestine. Until 1948 the majority of the people living there were Palestinian, but 750,000 of them were driven from their homes, never allowed to return. At least 450 of their towns and villages were emptied, and in their place the State of Israel was founded in 1967. Israel occupied the remaining parts of Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And it was in Gaza that Hamas was born. There's been a lot of interest in Hamas and its goals since the group launched the biggest attack inside Israel on October 7, 2023. Politicians and pundits like reducing complex issues to simple binaries of good and evil. Hamas is a brutal terrorist organization. They're a bunch of many evil barbarian unleashing pure, unadulterated evil. They are not freedom fighters to a lot of people, though they are. So we're going to talk to an expert who will help us understand why they would think that, what Hamas wants, and how it's changed in the 35 years since it was founded. My name is Tark Boni. I'm a writer. I'm the author of Hamas Contained: The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance. Hamas was formed by an appeal to people who had been expelled by Israel from their homes. Hamas as a movement is a nationalist movement first and foremost, so it's a movement that is committed to the liberation of Palestine from Israeli colonization. The movement has never engaged in any activities or operations outside the land of historic Palestine. Hamas grew out of the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which had initially focused on charity, part work, and education rather than confronting Israeli occupation. It was secular nationalists and leftists under the exiled Palestine Liberation Organization who led that fight. The PLO is recognized by the UN as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. But in December 1987, without PLO input, a mostly unarmed uprising known as the First began against Israel in Gaza and the West Bank. Hamas declared its existence 2 days into the rebellion. It's worth taking a moment here to address something, because Hamas has an Islamic identity and Israel proclaims itself a Jewish state. A lot of people claim its animosity towards Israel is based on anti-Semitism. Boni says that's not accurate. This is a fundamental misreading of Hamas and of Hamas's politics. It has not employed tactics that are grounded in anti-Semitism or that necessarily fight against Israeli Jews because of their Judaism. So when we think about Hamas discussing the liberation of Palestine, what it means for the movement is dismantling a system of colonial violence. This was also addressed by Hamas's founder Ahmed 2017. The group addressed this in its updated charter. We'll get to that later, saying, quote, Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they are Jewish, but wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. The first Inata ended with the 1993 Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO. The PLO gave up its claim to historic Palestine, renounced violence, and recognized the State of Israel. In exchange, a Palestinian Authority run by the PLO would have limited autonomy over some parts of the occupied West Bank and Gaza. The right of return for refugees would be discussed in future negotiations that were meant to lead to a Palestinian state in just the West Bank in Gaza. While many Palestinians saw this as a hopeful moment, others felt that the PLO had given up too much for too little. Hamas was among those opponents, and its members were persecuted by both Israel and the PA, but its opposition wasn't just verbal applause. Hamas's military wing is known as theme brigades when Hamas constituted itself In 1987 as the movement we understand. Today, it re-emerged through this social infrastructure as a military movement, so it began amassing weapons in order to commit to resisting Israel. After an American-Israeli settler killed 29 Palestinians at a mosque in Hebron, Hamas responded with what would become its signature tactic for the next decade: a suicide bomb deadlier and more dramatic than shooting soldiers. These attacks had two goals: one was the disruption of the Oslo Accords, and two, by expanding its targets to include Israeli civilians, Hamas hoped it would pressure the Israeli government to end the occupation. But these tactics were controversial even among Palestinians, and even within Hamas itself, so there was a lot of discussion internally amongst Palestinians about the morality of targeting civilians. Of course, under international law, targeting civilians is illegal. However, the Palestinians were operating in a reality where the violence of the apartheid structure itself was targeting civilians day in, day out with no accountability, and Hamas at the time believed that inflicting at least some damage on Israeli civilians was a way of deterrence. But when a second in broke out in 2000, Hamas and other groups deployed dozens of suicide bombers, killing more than 1,000 Israelis instead of deterrence. These attacks gave Israel cover as it decimated Gaza and the West Bank, killing more than 4,900 Palestinians. After that uprising died down in early 2005, Hamas pretty much abandoned suicide bombings. But it didn't abandon armed opposition to Israeli occupation, and the next few years would see the group evolve in major ways, both militarily and politically. From its founding to the end of the Second Ennahda, Hamas had been an opposition movement, but as the Palestinian Authority's negotiations with Israel failed to create a Palestinian state or even stop Israel from building more settlements, Hamas's popularity grew. The US-European Union and Israel consider the group to be a terrorist organization, but the UN and most other countries do not, and soon Hamas would become the central actor in resistance to Israel, from a small fighting force to a guerrilla army, from rebels to rulers. How did that happen? In 2005, Israel disengaged from Gaza and pulled its settlers and soldiers out. Israel claimed it was now no longer responsible for the people who lived in Gaza, but the withdrawal didn't end the occupation. Israel still dominated the territory from the outside, controlling borders, trade, telecommunications, the sky, the sea, but the settlements were gone. So Hamas, which had been attacking the Gaza settlements and military bases, saw it as a vindication. In its view, armed resistance was the way to get rid of Israeli settlements. In 2006, looking to play a bigger role in Palestinian politics, Hamas took part in Palestinian Authority legislative elections. This was a big change. Hamas had boycotted the previous elections, saying elections under Israeli occupation were part of the Oslo process. It opposed. Now its CLA claimed that the collapse of Oslo meant things were different, and to many people's surprise, it beat President Mahmoud Abbas's ruling Fatah party in both Gaza and the West Bank. Rather than respect the results of the democratic election the U.S. supported by Israel, decided to engage in a regime change operation. So essentially it began to facilitate for a coup to prevent Hamas from emerging as a governing authority that was democratically elected. Israel arrested enough of the newly elected Hamas members in the West Bank to prevent the legislature from functioning while in Gaza. Months of deadly street fighting between Abbas's US-backed security forces and Hamas loyalists left hundreds of people dead. Until June 2007, when the Qassam brigades routed the security forces and expelled them from Gaza. Within 2 years, Gaza had gone from being controlled by the Israeli military to being controlled by Hamas now in response Israel tightened a blockade that had already been placed on the Gaza Strip in different iterations. In the past and in its initial thinking, Israel used the blockade as a punitive tool really to punish the Palestinians, and to try to force them to bring down Hamas as a governing authority. The blockade has had a huge impact on Gaza, with 80% of its factories shutting down. Since it began, unemployment is at least 46% and travel, fuel, electricity and medical aid have all been restricted, but isolating Gaza like this also served other Israeli goals. For a long time Israeli governments have wanted to remove Gaza's population from the country's demographic equation, and getting rid of this demographic problem would allow Israel to maintain itself as a quote-unquote Jewish majority state. That's because when you include Gaza's population there are actually as many, if not more, Arabs living under Israeli rule as there are Jews. But to keep Gaza separate, Israel has relied on what Boni calls a violent equilibrium with Hamas. Here's how it worked when conditions in Gaza have become especially difficult. Hamas has often fired rockets at Israel. The response has often been a massive Israeli assault, after which a ceasefire is negotiated and some restrictions lifted for a while. There have been several major assaults in 2008 and 2009, 2012, 2014 and in 21 which have killed more than 4,000 people in Gaza. On the Israeli side, less than 100 people were killed. Israeli officials have referred to this endless cycle of siege and violence as mowing the grass. Now this violent equilibrium relied on the premise that there doesn't need to be a political resolution to the Gaza Strip, that Israel could deal with it only militarily, and that the blockade could continue indefinitely regardless of the fact that it was premised on collective punishment and the forced imprisonment of 2 million Palestinians. Back in 2012 the UN warned that unless the blockade was lifted Gaza would be uninhabitable by 2020. Meanwhile, with Gaza separated from the West Bank, Israel had a freer hand to expand its illegal settlements over there for the sake of the million